Good evening. Welcome to Diamond Event Center at Jorgensen Plaza for Wellbeing. I'm Carolyn Martin, Director of Volunteer Services here at Western Home Communities. Thank you all for arranging your time to be with us this evening. A very special welcome to our families and friends of Creekside and Grundy Center who are watching via live stream at the Kling Memorial Library, and to our families and friends of Winding Creek Meadows in Jessup who are watching at the Jessup Public Library. Special thank you to Lindsay Engelkus and Becky Burke and your staff members for making that possible, along with Steve Lewis and the Tech of Ages team from Western Home who are helping to manage our live stream tonight. I'd also like to thank Pat Beck, Western Home Communities Communications Assistant, Linda Bowman, Chief Communications Officer, Courtney Gall, Amy Dahl, and the Diamond Event Center staff, Sonia Thrall and the Jorgensen Plaza launch team for their help and support in getting us to this point tonight. I hope you had the opportunity to visit with the representatives of the organizations that are here tonight with their resource tables. We're very fortunate in the Cedar Valley to have willing and available resources for just about every circumstance you can think of. Thank you for being with us tonight, and thank you for the work you do with families every day. We are here tonight to acknowledge, honor, renew, inspire, and educate those who have or will accept the role of caregiver for someone they love. Though Western Home Communities is in the business of caregiving, we know that there are many in our communities who are fulfilling that role of caregiver at home because they love the person who needs care. Many times no one was asked to fulfill that role, and many times they may not even realize that they're in that role until someone identifies them as such. This program came out of a desire to reach out to family caregivers and say, we see you. We recognize the joys and the sorrows of the role you are in and want to offer a hand, a shoulder, an ear to listen to and to hear what you need to stay vibrant, healthy, and experience well-being in that role. I consider us very fortunate that while doing some research on how we could do that, I ran across several articles written by Dr. Barry Jacobs. After reading some of the articles and listening to some of his presentations, I was pretty sure this was the guy we were looking for. When Pat and I had a brief phone conversation with him and found out that his wife, Dr. Julia Mayer, was part of the deal, we were certain we had found the right team to address the emotional well-being of caregivers. Dr. Jacobs and Dr. Mayer are clinical psychologists that have joined us from the Philadelphia area. Dr. Jacobs is a family therapist and author of the book, The Emotional Survival Guide for Caregivers, Looking After Yourself and Your Family While Helping an Aging Parent. Since 2008, he's been the national spokesperson on family caregiving for the American Heart Association and American Stroke Association. He's on the expert panel for the AARP Advisory Panel and writes a monthly caregiving column for AARP Online. As an educator, he's held positions with the Crozier Keystone Family Medical Residency Program, Temple University School of Medicine, the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, and the Department of Psychology of the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. Dr. Mayer has been engaged in individual and couples therapy for almost 25 years. She's the author of a novel, A Fleeting State of Mind, and in private practice in Media, Pennsylvania, where she specializes in women's issues, including caregiving and other relationship concerns. She's held adjunct teaching position at the Institute for Graduate Clinical Psychology of Widener University and in Widener's undergraduate programs. She was an instructor for the master's program in creative arts therapy at Hahnemann University for 8 years. Together, Dr. Jacobs and Dr. Mayer have authored the book Meditation for Caregivers. Both of the books that they have been instrumental in writing, both the Emotional Survival Guide for Caregivers and the Meditations for Caregivers books, are available in our market just across the hall from Diamond Event Center. The market will be open till 8:30 this evening. It's been a joy to be with them throughout today, and I know you'll be blessed by their presentation and encouragement. Please help me welcome Dr. Barry Jacobs and Dr. Julia Mayer to the Cedar Valley.
Thank you, Caroline. Welcome, everybody. We want to acknowledge just what a wonderful, warm welcome we've had from Western Home, from Caroline, from Pat, from Sonia, from Jerry. I mean, this has been a wonderful experience for us to come here, and especially to be part of this celebration for the Jorgensen Center. This is really an impressive place, and we go to a lot of places around the country. I can't say I've seen a place as nice as this. So I think you're very fortunate. So let's give a round of applause. And so just for a little bit of housekeeping before we begin, Julie and I had a chance to circulate and talk with some of you just to kind of get an idea of who's here tonight. But how many of you are caring for a spouse? Okay. And how many of you are caring for a parent? And probably just split right down the middle, just like usual. And how many of you are caring for a loved one who unfortunately has dementia? Okay. Well, I think you're in the right place, because we're going to talk about all those things tonight. So shall we get going? And just for starters, we happen to present very informally. So I don't have a lot of hair, but I like to run through the audience like, like Phil Donahue used to do. But I think we're going to make this more of a conversation as much as possible, and hopefully within the next hour or so, we'll teach you some things that'll be of help to you. How does that sound? Good. Okay. So, whoops, that is not what I want to do.
We just use the one on the computer.
Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we know about family caregiving in this country, because it's now become this very large phenomenon that is getting more and more national attention. We're going to talk a little bit about what the strains and gains of family caregiving are for caregivers, because I think for most of us, we have signed up to do this for our loved ones because we want to do this for them, but that doesn't make it necessarily easy to do. It's often very hard to do. Our goal here is to talk about how to do this in a way that is as smart and as strategic as possible, so that you do the job you want to do and it doesn't wear you out in the process. Sound like a good idea, right? And then we're going to talk a little bit about what are the things that we suggest for you in providing care to your loved one in a way that may be most helpful for them and most helpful for you. So that's just what we have in mind. And we want to just start off with our own family stories, and we'll do this rather quickly. So if you can look on either side here, this is a picture from 1942 of my dad, just after he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, and he's at a dance with my grandmother, who, if you can see her expression, she's glowing, because my dad was her oldest son, and she favored him and was actually very, very possessive of him. So in 1942, he went off to World War II and then came back 3 or 4 years later and actually moved back into his parents' house, and then stayed there with his mother kind of waiting on him hand and foot for the next 10 years or so. So my dad was a real mama's boy. And then here's a picture from my parents' wedding in 1957. You don't see quite that much taffeta nowadays. And here's another picture of the wedding, and there's my mother on the right and my dad in the white tuxedo on the left, and there's my grandmother in between them, which is actually where she liked to be in their marriage. So my grandmother and my mother used to compete for my dad's affection and his attention throughout their marriage, and my mother sort of got along okay with my grandmother. They certainly weren't close, but they were kind of had a wary respect for one another. Until when my dad was 51 years old, he developed brain cancer, and I was 14 at that age. And what happened then is that my mother and my grandmother proceeded to fight about everything that they could possibly fight about. So they fought about where my dad was going to be treated and what kind of treatments he would receive. And my grandmother read about this experimental treatment for brain cancer out in California, and wanted my mother to sell our family home in New York and move the family cross country to California in order to give my dad the best chance of surviving. And my mom, like all of us, was not just a wife. She was also had multiple family roles. She was a mother to her own her children. She was a daughter to her own aging parents who lived nearby. And so after thinking about this, she said no to my grandmother. And pretty much from then on, these two women had no relationship, that things completely broke down. So much so that after my dad died, about a year after he was first diagnosed, my mother and grandmother then did not speak at all for the next 17 years until the day in 1990 when Julie and I got married. So I offer this story to you by way of saying family crises, like medical crises, sometimes bring family members closer together, and everybody bands together to meet the crisis head on. Or what sometimes happens is that family members split apart. And that's certainly what happened in my family with bad consequences. So what happened for me is not only did my mother not lose her relationship with my grandmother, but I lost my relationship with my grandmother to a large degree too, because I still saw my grandparents, but it wasn't the same. I would go over to my grandmother's house and grandfather's house, and they would basically badmouth my mother. And I was a 15, 16-year-old, 17-year-old kid. That was not very, very pleasant for me to hear. So what I say to you is we do the work we do because we want to help family members handle family caregiving better than my family did. We want to make this an experience that strengthens your families and not weakens those families. I have more family stories, excuse me. So my mother went on to get remarried, and she had a very nice marriage to a gentleman named Steve, who she was married to for about 30 years. And then they moved to Florida, and they were living the good life in South Florida, and my stepfather was playing golf 3 times a week until he developed Alzheimer's disease, at which point my mother really couldn't handle him anymore, and Julie and I moved the two of them up from Florida to live in an apartment a mile from us in Pennsylvania, and then and this is in 2010, we got very involved in caring for them both. And here is about a year after my stepfather and mother moved up, my stepfather went into a nursing home, and my mother would literally go 3 times a week to spoon feed him to his lunch. And what was always amazing to me is I found the nursing home to be a very dreary and kind of upsetting place. But for my mother, she was so glad to be there, and if she could get her husband, my stepfather, to actually eat his whole lunch, she was completely thrilled. And I was very impressed with the kind of devotion she had for him. And then, unfortunately, my mother declined after my stepfather died, and she too wound up in a nursing home with her own dementia. And then, here I am at her nursing home, taking care of her there, and my mother died in April of last year. So we do this work, and we've been doing this work for many years, but I got to say that the work that we've done with our own parents, you'll hear Julie's story in a moment, really informs a lot of the clinical and teaching work that we do now. And without my parents, and Julie's parents, I don't think we really would have a real experience of what family caregiving is about. Okay, I just clicked it for you.
Thank you. So this is a picture of my parents and our daughter, who's now 26 years old, so it's an old photo. Before we moved Barry's mother and stepfather up to live right near us outside of Philadelphia, my mother, as time went by, began to have to take care of my dad. He had type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure, and he developed kidney disease and had small strokes, and he ended up with vascular dementia. And so probably 15, 18 years after this photo, my mother was busy taking care of my dad regularly, and probably like many of you, self-care was at the bottom of her list. Care for him was at the top. And even though my siblings and I would try to talk to her about it, she was very dedicated to taking care of him. Every now and then, my sister and I would take her to Atlantic City for a weekend, and my older brother would stay with my father, and we'd have a fun weekend of respite for her, but really not frequently enough. And that's a picture of her and I on a balcony in Atlantic City, overlooking the ocean. So it was fun. About 10 years ago, my mother had heart surgery because she had a bad valve and she needed some bypass. And even though the surgery went well, a few days later, unfortunately, she passed away suddenly as the result of a bad side effect. So we were stunned and grieving, and we had to make a new plan to take care of my father all of a sudden because we had not been prepared for that. And I have a brother in San Diego, a brother in New York, a sister in New Jersey, and I'm in Pennsylvania. My father lived in New York. So this is a picture from my mother's funeral. There's my father and my two brothers and I, and my sister took the photo. It was a horrible day. But we all came together, which was challenging on many occasions. I don't know if any of you have to deal with your siblings when you're doing caregiving, but it can be very challenging. We came together and developed a plan where every other weekend I would drive 3 hours to give my brother relief. He was the primary caregiver, and I would spend the weekend with my dad. It was at the same time that we had teenage children. And shortly after my father passed away, we moved Barry's parents up to live near us. So we have been serial caregivers for it lasted about a decade.
So our stories are not unusual. As a matter of fact, our stories are very common, right? There's nothing really unusual about any things we shared. So right now, there are a lot of people in America who are doing this kind of work. As a matter of fact, there are about 40 million of us who are caring for our loved ones in some form or manner. And these are numbers that are increasing because, number one, our population is aging. And as people get older, unfortunately, they have more chronic illnesses and usually need more help. And then the other reason why that number is growing is because there are more medical advances which are keeping people alive longer with the kinds of health conditions that would have killed them years ago. So people live longer with heart disease, they live longer with cancer, they live longer with even neurological issues, but they don't live longer whole and self-sufficient. They live longer with the kind of functional deficits for which they need help, and that help primarily comes from family. So thus, we have this growing population of family caregivers. If you look at that population, it's divided pretty much by 60-40 women to men. About 10 years ago or 20 years ago, if I showed you this, it would have been 70-30, so us men are beginning to step up and do a little bit more. And that, I'm a baby boomer, and I thought, well, it's just us baby boomers that are doing this work. But in fact, about a quarter of all of the 40 million caregivers are actually millennials, meaning people in their 20s and early 30s, and another quarter are Generation Xers. So this is affecting almost every generation now. The average caregiver, if you boiled that 40 million down to one person, it would be a 49-year-old woman who's been caring for her mom for about 4 years, also works at least part-time, and also has other child care or family responsibilities. So they're taking care of the generation below them with their own maybe teenage children. They're taking care of the generation above them, and they are what is called the sandwich generation caregiver. They're being squeezed by pressures on both ends, and they're pretty stressed. But that said, it's a real heterogeneous population. Even when we go around the room, I'm sure we'd find many different circumstances, many different people don't fit that profile. When we look at what we ask family caregivers to do, if you can look at this list here, it's really, lots of people step into this role without much training and without really knowing what they're getting into, and suddenly they find they're taking on a whole host of tasks that they may not be prepared for. So they may not just be a companion or provide a little bit of entertainment for their loved one, but they may not be, they're driving places, but they also have to become this kind of communication expert. They get information from the doctor. They have to disseminate that information to the rest of the family. They've got to field all kinds of questions and concerns from the family. They have to explain to the doctor what's really going on with the patient oftentimes, so that they have this kind of translation role between the professionals and the family. They end up having to be this sort of coach, kind of coaching their loved one a lot of the time and cheerleading them a lot. And they also have to be a kind of case manager oftentimes, taking information from the cardiologist's office and bringing it to the primary care doctor's office and bringing that other information to the neurologist's office. Because even though our health systems all have these electronic medical records, and we expect all those doctors to be connected electronically with all the latest information about the patient, it doesn't happen that readily. So instead, it still falls to family members to make sure that each doctor knows what the medication changes have been made by other doctors, et cetera. So when you look at all those caregivers and look at all the things that they have to do, you expect that a lot of them are going to be pretty stressed out. and a lot of them are. So about half of them will tell you that caregiving is at least somewhat stressful for them. And I think Julie and I would have raised our hands. I said, yes, it was somewhat stressful for us. About a third of them will tell you that they're highly stressed by caregiving, that this is something that just is wearing them out, and they're struggling to manage every day. But then there's this small percentage of people, 16% of people, 18% of people, who will say that they're not stressed at all. As a matter of fact, most of these folks don't even define themselves as family caregivers. They define themselves as good wives or good daughters. They're just doing what a good family member does. And they don't put any special significance in the fact that they are providing care to a loved one. And I think that's great in its way with one qualifier, and that is, if you don't identify yourself as a family caregiver, then you don't avail yourself of family caregiver support services that exist in your community. And every community, this community included, has lots of services for family caregivers, support groups and home health aides, and you know. But in order to kind of say I want that help, people have to raise their hand and say I'm a family caregiver who needs help first. So it's important. You know, those of you who are here, you're here because you've defined yourself as someone who's in this role. But there are lots of folks doing this who don't even think about what the role is or what is maybe how it may be affecting them. When you kind of drill down and look at that 40 million caregivers a little bit more specifically, there are three types of caregivers that are more stressed than others. So one of them, maybe not surprisingly, are spouses. So if you're a spouse caring for your loved one you've been married to, and they have dementia, or they have Parkinson's disease, or they got MS, you are pretty stressed. And as a matter of fact, you're more stressed than adult children, generally speaking, and that's because your whole life has been wrapped up in this person. I mean, today, this afternoon, we had a meeting. I had a meeting of men who were caring for their wives, and Julie had a meeting of mostly daughters, but some wives caring for husbands. And many of the men in my group were very glad to be doing what they're doing. Some of them had been married to their wives for over 60 years, which I thought was amazing. But it was not easy for them to watch their wives declining, or to have to do the daily tasks required to keep their wives at home or in as good a shape as possible. So spousal caregivers have a difficult time. Another group, which we don't talk enough about, are military caregivers, especially since the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. So military caregivers are dealing with returning wounded warriors who are coming home with traumatic brain injuries and PTSD. And it is rough to live with someone who has those kinds of injuries. And so fortunately, the Department of Veterans Affairs and a lot of other caregiver support organizations are focusing a lot on military caregivers in order to enable mostly women to play these roles as successfully as they can. And the third group, not surprisingly, is going to be folks who are caring for loved ones with dementia. I would say right now there are about 5.7 million Americans who have Alzheimer's disease, and that is a number I'm afraid to say continues to grow and will continue to grow for a long time to come, especially as our population ages. And so right now it's we have 5 million. By 2050 or so, it's going to be closer to 15 or 25, between 15 and 25 million, they say, depending on a number of different factors. What we have is just a statistic I always find very interesting. At the time that a loved one is diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and granted they may have had symptoms for many years before that, but on the day that they are diagnosed by a neurologist, say, or by a primary care doctor, from that day forward, they will live on average another 7 to 8 years. And granted, there's also a lot of variability on that. There are people who live another 2 years, there are people who live another 20 years, but on average 7 to 8 years. But if on that day you ask their family members how long they expect to have to provide care for their loved one, the greatest portion of them will tell you they expect to provide care for 2 years. So what does that mean? It means that there's a big discrepancy right from the get-go between how long people expect to have to provide care and how long their loved one is going to need care. And that, to us, is the difference between someone who thinks they're running a sprint, Like anybody can set aside their hobbies, some of their social outings, maybe even set aside their job for 2 years to care for somebody. But then we're in year 3, and then we're in year 4, and now we're in year 5. And if you've been running full tilt as a sprinter that whole time, you are now exhausted. If you're running a marathon, and if you know you're going into it running a marathon, you bring a different mindset and a different strategy to that race. You're going to run a marathon, you're going to pace yourself, you're going to replenish yourself regularly along the way, because otherwise you will never get from the start to finish. So we'll talk a little bit more about this marathon metaphor in a little bit, but dementia caregivers set themselves up for burning out if they don't take care of themselves early on. And then what happens is the caregiver often has health problems, and the person with dementia winds up in a nursing home, which is often what nobody wants. It's certainly necessary and sometimes very, very good, but oftentimes this is not what the family caregivers want when they set out to provide care. All right. So just a little bit more about dementia caregiving, and then we're going to move more into, we're going to have a little bit of a conversation, because I'm throwing lots of statistics at you. So there are 2 sets of research about the effects of family caregiving on caregivers that are contradictory. So I'm going to present both sets to you, and then we'll try to kind of puzzle it out together. So there was a lot of research that was done in the late 1990s and early 2000s specifically about dementia caregivers. The gentleman up in the corner there is Dr. Rich Schultz. He's a social psychologist at the University of Pittsburgh, one of the foremost dementia caregiving researchers in the country. And what he found is that dementia caregivers were prone to a cascade of bad effects, of both medical and psychological effects. So what would happen is that after the caregivers would be showing up in doctors' offices complaining of sleep problems, because they were living with a loved one with dementia, and they weren't going to sleep soundly every night. They were literally going to sleep with one ear cocked, listening for, is my loved one getting up? Are they walking around the house? Are they going to get out of the house and walk around the community? And so they would not sleep well. They would be waking up multiple times a night. And that became, was something that didn't just happen for days or weeks, but literally happened for months and years. And that sleep deprivation then predisposed them to other health effects. So they would then show up in doctors' offices complaining of depression and anxiety. And among dementia caregivers, the rate of at least mild depression is around 50%, very, very high. And then these folks would be showing up at doctors' offices for musculoskeletal problems, for neck and back pain, literally from the wear and tear of helping their loved one in and out of bed, on and off the commode, up and down the stairs, in and out of the car, that physical toll cumulatively would really play on them. And then, unfortunately, what Rich Schultz found is that these caregivers were so devoted to their loved ones that they were neglecting their own healthcare needs. So they weren't going to their own doctors to have their blood pressure taken, or they weren't having their blood sugars taken if they had diabetes, and consequently, they ended up dying at a higher rate from those illnesses than peers who had the same illnesses but who weren't caregivers. So in this article, there was an article that Rich Schultz wrote that came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1999. When that came out, it really created this big hue and cry in the public health community, and people said, oh my God, we have these wonderful people taking care of loved ones with dementia, and they are dying. They're getting sick and dying because as a society, we're not doing a good enough job taking care of them. And one of the last things that Bill Clinton did on his way out of office was he signed a revision of the Older Americans Act, which started what is called the National Family Caregiver Support Program, which is basically a set of services to support family caregivers, which is administered through the Area Agency on Aging in every county, every region in this country. And I know in Cedar Falls you have that as well. So this is one set of research. And just to give you a little flavor of this, of someone who's really suffering, I'm going to ask Julie to read something.
This is from the wife of an Alzheimer's patient. I don't think anyone can understand the intense, crushing isolation and loneliness of caregiving unless they have walked a mile in our shoes. I miss the intimacy we've had for more than 50 years. And I'm not talking about physical intimacy, although I miss that too. I miss having someone to talk to, or share a chuckle or one of our little inside jokes. It's all gone. I'm not ready to ditch my marriage vows and dash out and have an affair, but I long to have a companion again, even someone to just stand and hold me while I cry the tears I've had to squelch and swallow for so long.
Thank you, Julie. I mean, really sad. I mean, I'm sure many of you can relate to that. It's really heartbreaking to hear somebody in that anguish, wanting to care for someone they love, and watching that person basically kind of fading away a little at a time. But I want to kind of hasten to add that there's all this research that actually has found not these negative effects of caregiving, but as a matter of fact, some very positive effects of caregiving. So a recent research study done by AARP found that the vast majority of caregivers, if you ask them whether they think that what they're doing is worthwhile, the vast majority of them will say that it is worthwhile, but the majority of them will also tell you this is stressful work. So that's not news to anybody who's been doing this. It is stressful work. But just to kind of cite quote some people who I think exemplify this more positive narrative about family caregiving. You know, many of you probably know Lani Ali, the widow of Muhammad Ali, who died now about 2 years ago. And Lani Ali wrote, "When I wake up, I make the decision to speak in a joyous voice, to nurture positive energy, and to make this a good day." I mean, I think that's a wonderful attitude. You know, she got up on the right side of the bed. I don't always get up on that side of the bed, right? She's pretty remarkable to face some of the things that you face and to have that kind of attitude. And the other thing she wrote is the disease, and with her husband Muhammad, she was talking specifically about Parkinson's disease, but I think this applies to all diseases. The disease is not something to be afraid of. The more you know, the more empowered you become. And I think that's very true, that all of us, as part of our caregiving, have to learn a lot about our loved ones' conditions and also the treatments for those conditions in order to be informed about how best to help them, and also to have some idea of what's coming down the pike. With a progressive chronic illness like Alzheimer's disease, we have a pretty good idea of the trajectory of the disease, and people need to prepare for that as they continue to run this marathon. Or I'll give you some other quotes, and this is there's a great book that Carolyn loves, we love too. It's called Bettyville. It's by a guy named George Hodgman. He grew up in rural Missouri. He went away to work as a book editor in New York, and then his mom was home alone in the family home in Missouri. His dad had died, and his mom was beginning in the early stages of dementia, and he decided to leave New York and move back to Missouri. And this is what he said right at the beginning of his time with his mom. He said, "All I could think of that night was what would become of my mother. It was my turn to step up. I told myself that whatever happened, I would do this one thing right, better than I had ever tried to do anything, because even though my life was different, I wanted a place in the tribe. I still do." So, just to give you a little bit more information about George Hodgman, he's a gay man, and he had moved to New York in part because he didn't feel welcome in the town where he grew up, and he didn't really feel that accepted within his own family. But part of coming back to Missouri and taking care of his mother was really a kind of a way of trying to reconnect with his mom and with his family, and to achieve a level of acceptance with them that he had never had before. And after he had been doing this work for a couple years, he said this, "I know this home is just for now, but I treasure our days. I feel different than when I arrived, just a little more comfortable with myself, because I have come through for her. It has taken me so long to feel okay in my own skin, but I feel better, more at home in the world, most days." So there was something about taking care of his mom for those years that didn't just allow him to prove himself to her, but actually allowed him to prove himself to him, to make himself feel more comfortable with himself. So that's the kind of positive, transformative experience he had through caregiving. And obviously we're not all going to have that, but I think it was pretty extraordinary. Just one more quote before we wrap up and then have a little conversation. The gentleman here is a guy named David Kuhn, who's another dementia caregiving researcher, who I think nicely sums up some of the positive effects of caregiving. And David Kuhn writes, The majority of caregivers readily endorse caregiving gains or positive aspects of caregiving, including having the opportunity to serve as a role model, having the chance to give back to care recipients, experiencing an enhanced sense of purpose, feeling appreciated, and helping to maintain the identity and well-being of the family. So what I like about this quote is, number one, this idea about giving back. This is something when we ask caregivers about why they do the work that they're doing, this is a constant theme. I was well cared for by this person. I've been well loved by this person. I want to give back to this person. This is something that is very meaningful to me consequently. And this is something that I would choose to do no matter how hard it got. That's something we hear all the time. And then just to wrap this up now, you know, what we say ultimately is that caregiving brings strains and gains. We've talked about a little of each, and that what we really want to do in all of our work is figuring out ways of minimizing the strains and maximizing the gains, knowing that there's going to be some of each, but we want the balance to be that this is something at the end of the day, we look back on it and we pat ourselves on the back and we say, you know what, this was hard, but I learned a lot in the process, and I'm really glad I did it, and I think I did a pretty good job in the process too. So we've thrown a lot of statistics at you. Before we go on and talk a little bit about the keys of caregiving, just kind of want to open it up for any comments or any questions. And like I said, I'll run through the audience with a microphone and make believe I'm Phil Donahue. Okay, did we say anything that surprised you? Not too much, right? So that's what we do. We're nice psychologists. We come up and we tell people the things that they already know, and that you know, we try to say it in a nice, jovial way, and people like that. So I see Pat over there. Pat, you want to come? Oh, well, but we just got to be on camera, so you probably need the microphone.
How will I know when I need to have help, that it's really too much for me to handle myself? And how do I get over the guilt if I really need to take time off?
We start off with two easy questions, right? So the short answer to the first question about how do you know when it's time, when you need help, is that I think you find that you're having difficulty juggling all the different responsibilities in your life, and that what's happening is over time, with a lot of the illnesses our loved ones have, there's a kind of insidious process where they have more needs over time, and so we begin devoting more and more time to them and taking more and more time away from other things. And in the process, we suddenly realize that we are under enormous duress. Maybe we're having to take lots of time off from work. Maybe we're not spending so much time with our husband if we've been caring for our aging parent, and suddenly our marriage feels a little stale. Maybe we haven't seen our friends in a year or two. And maybe we're beginning to think, you know, I'm thinking that we need to begin to plug in some services here to make sure our loved one is well cared for, but that we're also doing this in a sustainable way.
I would like to think about it because that question makes me worried that the person asking is already feeling a little like she's drowning. So anyone who becomes a caregiver needs to ask that question right away. When do I need support? When do I need help? Right from the beginning. We're going to talk a little bit more, as Barry mentioned, about the marathon metaphor in which we talk about that. Help in small ways at the beginning, increasingly more intensive ways if necessary, but we always need help. Did you have a comment?
How do you get the person with the dementia to accept the services? Because my mom's dealing with dementia, but she's still pretty much lucid and in care of everything, but I can't get her to use one of the bus services to have somebody come in and give me a relief.
Good question.
So what I would tell you, Marcy, is that you know, obviously, it's not, you don't force services on someone. You don't say you're going to take these services no matter what, because you make people feel really diminished. We want to maintain their dignity, but you cajole a little bit. You say, well, why don't we try this one day a week and for 4 weeks and see how it goes. You kind of bargain with people. You kind of introduce change slowly if people are very resistant, and you kind of normalize it as much as possible. What often happens, I mean, so that you're talking about a transportation service, but a more common example is when you want to bring an aide into the home. And typically, people say, I don't want strangers in my house, and I don't trust them, and then what you do is you have someone come and you're there with them, and you spend the day, maybe you have lunch together, maybe you play cards together, but you're introducing this person not as kind of an outsider, but you're introducing this person as a potential friend and support, someone with whom you're all going to develop a relationship, and that person over time hopefully is not just simply going to be hired help, but is going to be a part of the family that is going to be of benefit to everybody.
Another thing that I try, doesn't always work, but I try, I will say, I did this with my mother-in-law, I'll say, I need your help. Could you help me with this? And of course, she would say, well, yes, I'd like to help you. And I would say, I really need you to allow me to put your med box together. Because she was doing it for a while, and then somewhere along the way, she was packing all the pink pills in one box and the blue pills in another box. That's not going to work for us. And she was really proud of the fact that she'd been doing it. And Marcy, your mom sounds like someone who loves her independence. So I think what I would say is, I need your help, because I can't always be here to help you get where you need to go, and there is this service. It would help me if you would try it.
Yeah, what Julie would really say is, your son Barry's a nervous wreck, and that unless you take this help from me, he's driving me crazy. And so my mother would then help Julie out so that I wouldn't be such a bear with her.
Whatever works.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions before we go on? I mean, I think we'll begin addressing some of these things as we continue. But I mean, these are all good questions, and what we're trying to find here is what's the right help at the right time in ways that don't strip people of their dignity, but also ensures their safety. And that balance is not always so easy to strike. Go ahead.
So real briefly, I just want to tell you about the book that we wrote. It kind of came out of Barry's writing for AARP, but they asked him if he would write these meditations for caregivers, and we had just become empty nesters. We were still taking care of his mother, but we had had so many caregiver experiences that we thought this would be a great project. And so it's 150 plus stories about caregiver experiences where there's a problem that gets solved, sometimes creatively, unexpectedly. There's psychological advice, there's a big appendix that has all kinds of resources, and there's some advice about meditating and how to do some self-care. So I just wanted to kind of explain it a little better. So, keys to caregiving. As caregivers, as we have been saying, often we're the last person on the list for self-care. So the first thing, and as a key to caregiving, is believe that caring for yourself is crucial. And we're going to talk a little further about each of these things. Accept negative and positive feelings. I've had so many conversations with people where they just feel so guilty about their negative feelings toward their loved ones. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Define commitments, which means decide what you can accept in terms of responsibility and what you just cannot, and know the difference. Utilize support. We will stress that constantly. Separate past from present. If we have time, we will talk about a person who worked with me who really benefited from that idea. And of course, think about the positive meanings in the sacrifices that you make. So to get back to caregiving as a marathon and not a sprint, what we like to say to caregivers is you have to learn your way around the path. If you are running a marathon, in advance, or early on, you need to know where are the hills, where are the ups, where are the downs, where is it a tricky part of the path. So what we mean by that is when you know that your loved one, let's say, has Parkinson's disease, learn about the disease. Learn about the likely progression of that disease. Or Alzheimer's. Early on, Alzheimer's isn't that difficult. Okay, mom misplaced her keys. But the progression of the disease is the thing that is important, because then you can prepare. You can figure out what you're going to do to get the support to keep running this marathon so you can make it to the end of the race successfully. It isn't a sprint. And maintain a sustainable pace. Early on, especially in dementia caregiving, but really any caregiving, it might feel like, I can take this, I can handle this, this isn't so hard. But it gets harder and harder as time goes by, and so you have to prepare. You want to maintain your pace. You have to prepare for what kinds of things you might need. If you're running a marathon, don't do everything. Put all of your, don't run a sprint at the beginning and then wear out and not make it to the end. So it's about managing your time and maintaining your energy so you don't burn out. Take any and all replenishment. As you're running that marathon, you get to the 5-mile point and people are waving water bottles at you. You don't say, no thanks, I don't need that. You take that water bottle because you know you need that water to get to the end. So one of your neighbors says, oh, I know you're really struggling doing all the caregiving you're doing. Can I bring you over a casserole? The answer is yes, please. Can I spot you so you can go to the supermarket by yourself? Yes, thank you. Always say yes, even if the care offered isn't exactly what you need, because you need some care. So you're always looking for that support, and it can be online, it can be in person, it can be church support groups, you name it. And then run alongside others. All of you are sitting here today because that's what you're doing. If you look around, everyone's a caregiver. It's really important to be able to have interactions with other people who are doing what you're doing and who have maybe they're a few steps ahead of you and they can give you a little bit of a pointer about what's coming up or what you might want to do. Sharing experiences is so helpful and definitely important for caregivers. Some things that are really important, just a little list. Protected time. It's so important for you to have some time to yourself. You know, it's one of the most difficult situations is spousal caregiving, in particular because you live together. Not always, but it starts out that way usually, and it's very hard to feel entitled to a break, entitled to time away. I was talking to someone in a group this morning, and she said, I visit my husband 2 or 3 times a day, and I feel like I need to cut back a little bit. And he's in a care home. And I said, you do need to cut back a little bit. 2 or 3 times a day is too much. You don't have time for yourself. You need time with friends or time to yourself. It can't all be about caregiving. You can't dedicate your entire every moment of your life to it. Physical exercise is so important. Caregivers often neglect that because it takes time, but it's very rejuvenating. It's good for your health. It's so important for stress. Spiritual practices you do not want to avoid them. They're so important and crucial for well-being. And mindfulness and relaxation exercises are important as well. So I just want to say a couple words about normalizing ambivalence. So many people, I've talked to so many people who say, I feel really guilty, but sometimes I just resent my mom. Sometimes I just feel so burdened. And they'll say, I love her, but I just resent her. I resent having to take care of her. And sometimes people won't even say that to me. They'll just feel guilty, and they'll be afraid to say that. So sometimes I'll say it. It's normal to have every feeling under the sun because we're all humans. So sometimes we feel angry, sometimes we feel sad, sometimes we love what we're doing. Forgive yourself if you have resentment or anger or guilt. It's all okay. It's just part of being human. So some caregivers who can't really acknowledge those negative feelings, they have a tendency to be perfect caregivers, which means they don't want to let anybody help them. They want to do it, they're the only one who can do it right, and they want to do it themselves. And sometimes if I can talk to somebody about their negative feelings, that need to do everything completely because I'm the only one I can count on, that loosens up a little bit. Having somebody help, they might not be perfect, it's true, not as perfect as you, but it's okay, it'll be good enough. So sometimes talking about those difficult feelings makes it a little bit easier for caregivers to loosen up that grip on perfect care. Well, I just said all that. Defining commitments. Is that you?
I thought it was you, but it could be me. So after 28 years, we're still working things out here. So anyway.
We switch them around.
Yeah,
so.
we do. So basically, defining commitments is essentially this. You are allowed, when you sign up to be a caregiver, you don't sign this contract without any terms on it. You are allowed to basically say, there are certain things I'm willing to do, there are certain things I'm able to do, and there are other things that I'm not willing to do and I'm not able to do. And even if you don't have a clear idea of what those things are at the beginning, you want to reserve the right for yourself to define your commitments as you go along. When people say to us, you know, how much caregiving you plan to do, and people say, whatever it takes. Well, whatever it takes it means oftentimes that they are willing to take on everything and anything without really taking into account what effect that's going to have on them or on their other responsibilities. So what we want is we want people to reserve the right to say, I'm willing to care for my loved one with dementia in my home for as long as possible, but if they become so agitated that they're up all night and making all kinds of a fuss and keeping me awake and I'm not getting any sleep, then I reserve the right to basically say, I can't live like this, and I have to live differently. And living differently might mean hiring someone to come into the house and stay with your loved one at night. It may mean that your loved one has to live in some other place. That may not be ultimately what you want, but the idea is our responsibility is to make sure our loved ones are cared for well, and there's no one way of doing that. There are lots of ways of doing that, and we have to make sure that we think through what our commitment is, what we're going to do ourselves, and what we're going to have other people help us do. Does that make sense? This is usually the idea when we present this to audiences. Everybody sort of there's not much conversation. People kind of look at us like, I really have a choice. I really have some choices here. And in fact, you really do have choices here. You don't have to do everything that may be required over the course of an illness. Things you may not even imagine happening. You're not required to take it all on. We live in societies where we have different services available to help us with these things. And like I said, we want to avail ourselves of those services.
The next thing is utilizing support. Like I said before, I've heard this so many times. Our family takes care of its own. Besides, no one can take care of him as well as I can. And that may be true. It's very likely to be true. But what's behind it often is this feeling of I need to be perfect. And also, it's shameful for me to need help to take care of my loved one, whether it's my dad or my sibling or my husband. I shouldn't need help because they're family. So we try to help people recognize that using services is a way to bolster the care, to make it better, to improve what you can do and for how long you can do it, instead of it being something like a failure experience or a shameful experience. This is a picture of Barry's mom and her caregiver from way back.
We'll go forward.
Skip it?
Just go to the next one.
Okay,
Yeah, next one after that.
we're jumping ahead.
Yeah. All right.
Finding positive meaning.
Okay, this one.
That's you?
Okay. All right.
We do switch them around a lot, so.
All right. I think I'm going to hear about this afterwards, but okay.
No.
All right. So what basically is the last idea we want to leave you with tonight, and then we can have some more conversation. If you go into this caring for a loved one, feeling like this is something you're supposed to do, or something that you have to do, then unfortunately, you're going to wind up feeling obligated, or you're going to end up feeling trapped. And that kind of mental attitude doesn't lend itself for sustaining yourself well through the course of caregiving. Instead, it's very important for people to find some sense of positive meaning, some sense of purpose in doing this that has some special significance for them. Because if you can find that special significance, then that sense of purpose can carry you through some pretty rough patches at times. So what we often do is ask people this question, why are you caring for your loved one? Why do you do, what does it mean to you to do this? And why don't we go right to Karen, please. Thank you, Julie. And so we'll just give you one example of something that someone said to us years ago, which we found very, very powerful. So this is Karen. She was caring for her father in her home. He had Alzheimer's disease. She'd been doing this for about 2 years. She was retired at this point, and her whole life had become consumed with caring for him, and she had become pretty burnt out. And so we asked her, why do you do what you do for your dad? And so she said essentially this. Shortly after I was pregnant, I left my husband. And then after the child was born, I decided I was going to go back with him. And my parents knew it wasn't going to work. And my mother kept saying, "You'll go back and have another baby." And my father said to me, "You can always come home." He left that door open for me. He said, "You can always come home. I don't care if you have 10 babies, you can always come home." He left that door open for me, and I did just that. I went back and had another baby and came back with 2 babies. And I'll never forget that. I always knew I could go home. What we heard in this is a woman who had been in a very bad first marriage with a man who actually was violent and was physically abusive towards her. And this was at a time when a lot of fathers would have said to her, when she came to his house, a lot of dads would have said, "You go home and work this out with your husband." But instead, her father said, "You can always come home. My door will always be open for you." And as a consequence of that, she left that first marriage and then was able to go on and have a much better second marriage. And for that, she was eternally grateful to her dad that he had provided that kind of support for her at a crucial time in her life. And consequently, she was always looking for a way to give back to her dad. And when her dad got Alzheimer's disease, that was an opportunity for her to give back to her dad. And so when friends would say to her, "Why don't you take some time off?" or doctors would say to her, "Listen, you need some respite, you need to attend a support group," she would kind of smile to them and politely kind of shake her head, but she wouldn't accept any of those services because she wanted to be there for her dad. And the idea of not being there for him would kind of go against what was something which was very, very personal and meaningful for her. And so one of the things that I did when working with her was to try to help her see, as Julie said before, that accepting help was not going to mean that she was abandoning her dad, but was going to help her feel that she was, in fact, more empowered to help her dad, that it was going to enable her to do a better job with him. But this idea that she was giving back to him made her caregiving much easier for her, because no matter how hard it was, she had this greater purpose that was pulling her onward. The other thing is that Karen was a very religious woman. She was a very good Catholic woman for whom she felt that God had placed this task in her life, and that she did not want to turn aside from it because caring for her dad meant that she was doing God's work in this world. And so, again, a very, very powerful personal and spiritual reason that meant that the caregiving was always going to be something very significant for her, and that was, in her mind, was the most important thing that she can do. Now, not all of us are Karen, not all of us have either that kind of dramatic story where basically a parent saves us, but I think all of us have ways in which we're grateful to the people who care for us, or many of us are grateful to the people who care for us, and now we're in a position where we want to give back to them. Or even if we've had a bad relationship with that person, what we have is sometimes we have moral or religious or spiritual reasons that mean that we want to continue caring for them, even if we don't like that person very much, even if they didn't treat us very well. But that there are certain moral values that we have that mean a lot to us. There's a woman I work with who said, I never liked my mom my whole life. She never was a very good mom to me, but I'm a moral person. This is what I want to do. So all of us need to find those sorts of powerful personal reasons, positive reasons to keep ourselves going. All right. And I think, why don't you wrap up with the story of and then we'll open it up.
Okay. Not everyone has such a fantastic story like Karen. Many of us who have been caregivers or who are caregivers are taking care of somebody much more difficult. Forgiveness is a complicated issue, and I like to think of it as more about letting go of the past, letting go of painful things, painful interactions, painful times, and being in the present, being mindfully in the moment. So whether you call it forgiveness or just anything else you want to call it, that's fine. But I think when I work with people who are in difficult caregiving situations, I help them focus on having empathy and compassion for perhaps their difficult parent that they're caring for. So I'm going to quickly tell you about somebody like that named Gloria. She was a nurse in her early 60s, and growing up, her birth father abandoned the family when she was too young to remember. Her mother married her stepfather when she was 5. She was very attached to her stepfather, but then he passed away when she was a teenager. The whole time, her mother was very depressed and pretty self-centered. So Gloria would tell me stories about coming home from school. The door would close behind her. Her mother would be on the couch and wouldn't even say hello to her, wouldn't say, how was school? And so Gloria actually came to see me in therapy before her mother was ill because she kept having bad relationships. And she sort of got to where they were better. She was in a good relationship, and then her mother developed vascular dementia, kidney disease. And Gloria said to me, she was a nurse, and so she said, I want to take care of my mother, but she's such a difficult person. And we spent a lot of time talking about the difference between adult Gloria, the nurse, the competent, capable, highly trained, effective nurse, and Gloria, the child who was still longing for her mother's approval, still trying to get her attention, still feeling such a lack of love. And in her taking care of her mother, she had this opportunity. It was over about a 2-year period. She had the opportunity to change the relationship with her mother. She, that's just a list of the kinds of things we think about. She was able to relate to her mother as professional Gloria instead of child Gloria. And even though her mother had always been pretty dismissive and rejecting, because Gloria was capable and was able to advocate for her in her role as a nurse, and not be so needy with her, her mother was much more able to respond in a more pleasant way. And they built a much better relationship over time, the time that Gloria was taking care of her. And by the end, it was the best relationship that the two of them had ever had with each other. Her mother actually talked to her, paid attention to her, and they felt sort of like they had a friendship. And even after she passed away, Gloria came to see me and said, through tears, that she was so grateful to have had these 2 years of caregiving, to be able to work on that relationship with her mother and have it be the best it ever had been, and that she could look back on that time and feel really good about what she did. So in terms of our goals for caregivers, that's the goal, It's hard work, it's stressful, but if it's rewarding and rewarding going forward into the rest of your life, you can always look back on it and feel like I did a good thing and it was meaningful to me and I grew from it. That's what we're looking for. So caregiving brings strains and gains. It always does. But we try to be flexible. We try to manage the strains as well as possible, come up with creative solutions, get support, and see it as a marathon, not a sprint, and make it the best possible experience it can be. And it can be a very good experience.
So we've shared a lot of ideas with you. We want to just kind of open this up again. If you have any responses, any things that we shared, then by all means share them. Be happy to hand you the microphone and you can share them with everyone. Or if there are questions you have about anything regarding caregiving that we haven't discussed, then by all means let's talk about them, because I'm sure if you have a question that probably other people in the room have the same question. So let me head over here. And you are?
Patty Burning. My question is, you talked a lot tonight about the caregiver, when we get burned out, to access those services. Well, that's wonderful. I mean, if you're financially able to do that, or your loved one is. My experience, my mom is not able to do that private pay. And in this community, of course, everywhere there's the push to keep people in their homes, okay? In our community, unless other people have more knowledge than I do, just to access those services, it is very difficult in Black Hawk County.
So, Patty, you're bringing up, some real practical matters here. Obviously, we don't know about the services in Black Hawk County, and I'm actually hoping there might be someone here who is familiar with the services in Black Hawk County. What we typically recommend to folks is to contact your area agency on aging, because they're usually the repository for all services. And so, and I don't know if you've done that, Patty, but okay. So, what we do is we talk about 3 circles of care, 3 circles of support. So the first circle is obviously within your own immediate family as much as possible. So, and Patty's shaking her head saying, like, no go there. So the second circle of support would be a larger circle, would be your extended family and your friends and maybe your church members. And you begin looking for folks in your larger community to see if your church has some sort of transportation service, or they have some sort of senior ministry to help you, whether you have other family members who could step up and help. Clearly every situation is going to be a little bit different. And then the third circle, and really the last circle where people look, is professional services. And as you're pointing out, Patty, those services can be expensive. In our experience, in our home state of Pennsylvania and also around the country, many counties have county funding specifically to help support family caregivers and to help older adults, because they know that if the counties don't support them and keep them in their home, then those older adults will go into nursing homes, skilled nursing facilities, which will cost the county and state a lot of money. So there's a lot of incentive on the part of governmental agencies to provide the support to keep people in their home. So everything I'm saying to you, Patty, is all kind of theoretical. I mean, you would have to apply this all to your particular situation, your particular finances, and the services that exist in this county. But I would think about, again, those 3 circles: immediate family, extended family and community, and then looking at the professional services and looking for county funding to pay for it. And if there's anybody here who's really familiar with those services, if you could connect with Patty afterwards, that would be great. Okay. You are?
My name's Jaylene, and I'm not from this county, but my mom is 98 years old, and I was caring for her at home in a little house next to mine, and it just got to be too much for me. We got homemaker health aides to come in, but she was getting more and more depressed. So about 2.5 weeks ago, we put her in assisted living, and within less than 2 days, she was goofy as a coon. She was just off the rails, confused. She is better today, but still has a lot of confusion. And I guess my issue is that I feel sort of guilty trying to not be there every day, but I'm trying to back away. Like I took today to come up here and be with my daughter, and next week I'm hoping to add another day to that, to be away. And is that okay? I guess, is it okay to let somebody else take the reins? It's hard to let go.
Yeah, Jillian, I think that's a really, thank you for sharing, because I mean, what you're describing something which is really difficult, especially if you've been the primary caregiver for a long time. So, Julia, I know you have thoughts on this topic. I have thoughts on the topic also. Do you want to start?
Yes, because it's a marathon. So if you're there constantly, you're burdened. You do not have your own life. You're too involved in hers. I understand leaving her in the hands of someone else is not ideal, and you don't know exactly how she'll be treated. But I think the solution is imperfect, but it is better sustained than if you're there all the time. And it sounds like your daughter would like to spend some time with you. That's important too. You get support and you also get time with her. That's as important as the time with your mother, really.
Yeah. And just to pick up on a couple of things that Julie said, so everybody feels guilty when they make a decision like that, because especially when their loved one goes into a nursing home and then they seem to function worse, they're more confused or they seem more depressed, and then you feel like, oh my God, what have I done? So it is true that when people have a certain amount of cognitive impairment, that moving from one environment to another can often be disorienting for them, and it can take a long time, if ever, for them to really orient to the new place. But as Julie said, there are no good solutions here. Having her continue to stay in her home is not a good solution. Having her go to this facility or any facility is also not a perfect solution. So you're choosing among kind of somewhat undesirable solutions and trying to live with the consequences of any of them. The fact is, you know, your mom has lived a really long time, probably through you know, God's grace, but also through your good efforts. And you should be proud of having kept her alive this long. You haven't given up on her at this point, but you're seeking some helping hands to help her with this leg of the journey. And you know, I hope that she's able to adjust and actually learn to enjoy that environment. You know, when I was talking with you about Karen before, you know what, eventually, even though she swore she would never put her dad in a nursing home, she put him in a nursing home, and she felt exactly the same way you did. It's hard to let go. She felt tremendous guilt. But what happened is when her dad went into a nursing home, he got better. He got better because he wasn't just home watching TV all day. He was suddenly around all kinds of other people. He was much more socially stimulated, and he kind of came out of a little bit of a trance, a little bit of a funk, and he lived the last 2 years in a nursing home, and he did really well. But making that transition is emotionally wrenching for people who've been on the front line providing the care for a long time. So I want to say to you, Jolene, not only is this okay, it's actually a good thing, and hang in there and give it some time.
It's your best way to care for her, really.
Okay. Other thoughts or questions?
One over there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go running.
Your name is?
Carol, and I take care of my husband. So he broke his hip about 4 years ago, and I'm pretty much doing almost everything as far as that goes. The problem is I want him to acknowledge that I'm doing this stuff, and instead he argues with me, and he's just a big pain in the butt.
Boy, have I heard this one before. Thank you.
What, was everyone clapping because he's a pain in the butt or because Carol?
She's saying it like it is, and I appreciate the honesty. I have definitely talked to many women who are caring for their husbands, and maybe he was a little bit of a pain in the butt in the past, but it's gotten bigger. So it's gotten a lot worse. And, you know, what is he suffering from? He had a stroke?
No, he did. He broke his hip.
Oh, he broke his hip.
Yeah.
So he can't get around. He's very frustrated. He feels diminished. And so he takes it out on you, the person he loves the most.
Well, you know what? Throwing a fit is good exercise too, I think.
I think what Barry's saying is it's a very difficult situation when he gets angry over so many things, and your best tool is to keep your sense of humor and not take it personally as much as possible. He's struggling, and it sounds like an extra big struggle because no one exactly knows what the problem is, and he's not compliant with what the doctors want him to do, and he throws a fit. That's where you have to pull back and really detach yourself from it, because it's aimed at you and it's not fair, and he probably can't help it.
Yeah, I agree, Carol. It's not fair, and I will just tell you, speaking as a man, the male ego is a very fragile thing, and you know he is diminished, as Julie said. He is not the man he was, and he probably has some frustration about that. And rather than being angry at the way life, you know, old age is hurting him or life is worked out, he's got a ready target who's there, you know,
Trying to be caring.
trying to be helpful, and so he'll battle you instead. And I agree with her. You just have to back off. What's going to be is going to be, and let the physical therapist fight with him. I wouldn't get in that role. I wouldn't. You're never going to win that fight with him. And he may be the biggest pain in the neck in the world. Let him be the big pain in the neck, but not for you, for somebody else. Oh, well, that should tell you even more that he put. It's like he's the. This is gonna sound really derogatory, but he's like that kind of oppositional 4-year-old, who's like, I'm not going to do what you say, mommy. I'm going to. But you know, but when the 4-year-old's in the daycare, it does exactly what the daycare teacher wants, right? So you're in this. He's in a kind of just oppositional position with you. And the more you battle with him, the more he's going to battle back. And I would step out of that fight with him if I could.
You know, you suggest it, you try to help him, and when he starts to throw that fit, leave the room.
Yeah. You know what, Carol? He's got to want it. He's got to want to walk. You can't make him want it. And you can basically say to him, I've done my best. This is up to you. Your ball's in your court, and you got to do this. And I mean, if the responsibility says he may feel that he just can't do it, that's another issue. But he's almost kind of digging his heels in and saying, you can't make me do this. And that's different. So I wouldn't get into that tug of war with him. I would drop the rope and say, you're on your own, buddy. This is yours.
I can't make you.
Well, he should be aware of that. It has to be clear to him what the consequence would be if he doesn't make an effort. But you can't have more responsibility for this than he has. You know, as an old supervisor said to me, if you care more about the other person than they care about themselves, you have a conflict. He's got to care about himself and do this.
I'm sure he's too.
It's easy for us to say this, Carol, but it's really tough. But honestly, pushing him harder, if I thought it was going to work, I'd say to him, just push and push and push. It's not going to matter. So try the opposite. Try to say, I'm not going to push. It's up to you. Maybe one more question before we wrap up, because I see some people are starting to head out.
Okay, we're in a different situation here. We're taking care of our 38-year-old nephew. His parents, his siblings have walked away from him, so it's us two. Very angry. Doesn't want to do therapy. He lives with him, fights with him every night. He's angry with me right now because I can't go in there 3 times a week anymore. So how are we going to cope with this gentleman that, you know, he had a motorcycle accident and then had a stroke 2 days later? Yes, but with all the tests and everything, he knows what he's doing. He knows what he's saying. He just can't get it out. So he gets angry when you can't understand him. He's just angry. How do you deal with that?
Your first name is? All right. Teresa, again, this is another situation where you're working hard to help somebody who doesn't seem to be wanting to work hard on their own behalf, and instead is fighting you. So not a similar situation which Carol's dealing with. And I'll bring up one other idea which I should have shared with you, Carol, and that is when men get depressed, they don't get sad, they get angry, generally speaking. And what I would wonder, especially when people have had a neurological, any kind of neurological insult, they're at much higher risk for depression than they would be otherwise. So I don't know if your nephew has been evaluated for or been treated for depression, but he has been, and he's being treated for it, and is the treatment effective at all? Okay, which is a shame. So what I would say, first for starters, I would ask that he be reevaluated and have someone look at his treatment. And the treatment should not just be psychotherapy. He's going to need medication. And that medication would hopefully help him be less depressed. And then to figure out if he's not who he was, if he's not going to ever be who he was prior to his motorcycle accident and his stroke, then who could he still be, and does he want to be that person? Or has he given up on living? And if he's given up on living, that you're back in the same position that Carol's in, which is you can't want it more than he wants it. So he will need so we have to help him be less depressed. We have to help him find a sense of purpose in his life. How? Well. And Teresa, he's had tremendous losses. Tremendous, and I'm not going to stand here and minimize any of those. He's lost a lot, but that doesn't give him a license to take it out on you. And you're trying to give him the support, to give him a platform to rebuild his life, but he's got to want to rebuild his life. And if he doesn't want to rebuild his life, there's probably not a lot you can do to help him. And my hope is, and I worked for years in the field of traumatic brain injury with lots of folks who had motorcycle accidents, who were in exactly that same position. They felt that their life was over. And then the issue was, okay, you're still alive. God didn't take you. Now what? And he probably doesn't have an answer for you. And what I would say to you is he doesn't know the answer, but how can he find the answer? And you may not be able to provide him with that answer, but the idea is he really needs to look for that answer. He may find that answer through working with a psychotherapist. Medication may help him be less depressed. Working with some vocational rehabilitation might be helpful for him. Sometimes religion is helpful for folks in this instance. Many people in this situation are feeling very sorry for themselves. They're all wrapped up in their own pity party. And to put them in a position where they're now helping other people, anybody else who's more disadvantaged than they are, to get them out of this position of just being all curled up and feeling bad, that would be helpful for him to see that his life still has a sense of purpose where he can make a difference. And so that's what I would hope for him. Again, very easy for me to stand here and say these things. It's not easy to make this happen. I don't want him to take it out on you in the process. The fact that you're hanging in there with him is remarkable. So you guys are to be applauded, but he has got to want it. And you can't give that to him. He's got to look for it to find it. So I hope that doesn't sound harsh. Does that sound harsh, Teresa? It is really hard. I would bring him back to have him, whoever's treating him for depression, to go back to that person, have them look at his medication regimen. I would almost go so far as to say, he's living in your house. There are certain things that are required of him to continue living in your house. Right? I don't know if there are certain chores you want him to do. I don't know if there's certain treatments you want him to get. I don't know if there's certain programs you want him to engage in. But staying home and kind of waiting for life to happen is not going to work for him. Well, then I would not enable him to maintain that position. And giving him, food and shelter as any, out of kindness is great, but I would also, I wouldn't say to him, you need to be out by X date, but I would say to him, this is not a life for you, but it's also not a life for me, because misery loves company here, and living with you or your misery is making me miserable, and I can't do this. So you're going to have to work on this to make this better. Otherwise, I can't have you stay here. We have to come up with a different plan for you. And you're going to have to work at this, and I'll support you in working for this. So, again, I hope that doesn't sound too harsh, but he has to have expectations placed squarely on his shoulders that he's got to. This is his life. It's not your life. He's got to take the reins of his life. So, I wish you a lot of luck with it. All right. It is now almost 8:25. Maybe one. I see one more hand. One last question. Is that your hand? Did you want to talk to Teresa? Yeah. You want to talk to her right now? I'm going to hand. Can I hand you the microphone? All right.
Yeah, I just want to let you know we have a wonderful brain injury support group here in the Blackhawk County that I personally know of and have had family members in it, so we can get you that information. Well, no, we've got a group. Yep, we got a support group for you. Yeah, no, it's for you too. It's for you as well. So there's a lot with brain injury in this area that would be really helpful for both of you, and just to understand the brain injury part of it, and just the hard part of the loss that this person's taken, and the loss that you've taken on in your life too, because you've had to change who you are and what you've had to do. So there's a lot of support we hope we can get for you.
Thank you so much for that.
Sounds like a great offer to me. So maybe any other questions, or we answered everything? You guys know things perfectly. Maybe one last one. Here we go.
Is there a resource for a person who offers help to somebody who doesn't know what they even need for help? There's a lot of caregivers in here, and I'm not my mom's in the cottage, which I have a lot of help there, but I have friends who are dealing with situations. I'd like to be able to help them. And when I was in that situation, I didn't know what I needed myself. So how do they know what they need?
That's a great question. A lot of caregivers don't know what they need. And what we like to say is, show up and do something. Whatever it is. Just make them a dinner, give them a gift certificate, mow their lawn, whatever might be helpful to anybody, start. And maybe they will just appreciate your act of kindness.
And you'll find your way that way. Dr. Jacobs, Dr. Mayer, on behalf of the Cedar Valley and Western Home Communities, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. This event is one of several that we are using as kickoffs to the opening of Jorgensen Plaza for Wellbeing. Each month we've been celebrating one dimension of wellness, and this was the Emotional Wellness Month. And what we're hoping is that through these events and through the birth of the Jorgensen Plaza for Wellbeing, that we all become a little bit healthier and a little bit more well in that. And so to celebrate that, a lot of us here at Western Home Communities have these beautiful blue t-shirts that say, "Building a Better You." And so on our behalf, with our thanks, thank you. And Pat can exchange sizes for you. So thank you for helping us be better and to be more well in our lifestyles as well. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to our friends at Creekside and Grundy Center and Winding Creek Meadows in Jessup, and the libraries in those communities for hosting us tonight. This will be available on YouTube. Watch our Western Home Facebook page, and we'll have that link posted as soon as we get that ready for us.
So again, I want to thank Caroline. If anybody would like to talk further, we'll be up here for a little bit. And then if anybody would like to buy our books, we'll go next door to the market and we'll sign them for you, because that gives us the biggest thrill of all to sign our books. So we enjoy doing that a lot.
Thank you very much.